Hello and welcome to KLM Institute.
Genocidal and apartheid policies. Through our dealings with Gaza, we reveal who we are. Gaza has become a symbol of our attitude towards atrocities worldwide. If we cannot address Gaza, what legitimacy do we have to confront gross violations of human rights anywhere else? Secondly, because our handling of Gaza reflects our understanding of humanity. When Europe advocates human rights as universal values, do we truly mean it, or are they merely a tool for dominating political discourse? Thirdly, because humanity is indivisible. Values and norms are values and norms, everywhere, for everyone, also in Gaza. With this in mind, I would like to express my support for the initiative to award the Nobel Peace Prize to Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur.
Well, Israel's actions are completely unacceptable. It is outrageous that there be a blockade of food and supplies to people who are in need in Gaza. We've made that very clear by signing up to international statements. I made it clear in a discussion that I had with the President of Israel, President Herzog, in Rome just days ago. I made it very clear that Australia finds these actions as completely unacceptable, and we find Israel's excuses and explanations completely untenable and without credibility. People are starving, and the idea that a democratic state withholds supply is an outrage. Now, that is my clear position. It's one I've indicated clearly and directly to the Israeli government. It's one that will continue to be a part of international statements as we were last week.
Donald Trump, the US president, says the US will take over and own the Gaza Strip. Do you support that position, Prime Minister?
Well, I've said before that I don't intend to have a running commentary on the President of the United States' statements.
This is a major foreign policy move, though.
Hang on, it's not a dialogue. It's
Well, I think it is.
Well, if you let me answer. What I would say is that Australia's position is the same as it was this morning, as it was last year, and it was 10 years ago, and it was under the Howard government. The Australian government support, on a bipartisan basis, a two-state solution in the Middle East.
This is no ordinary statement, though. This is a potentially history-changing statement, and there's a real prospect that the US will ask allies like Australia to support it. Are you prepared to send Australian military into the Gaza in some sort of coalition of the willing peacekeeping mission? Is Australia prepared to help fund the rebuilding of Gaza?
When it comes to our position, we have not received any request regarding the rebuilding of Gaza. What we have said, though, clearly, we've supported a ceasefire, we've supported hostages being released, and we've supported aid getting into Gaza. There is a need to do that, and Australia is willing to assist getting aid into Gaza to provide that support. We have done so. That is consistent with what Australian governments have always done, which is to provide support.
Dear members of the media, I'm about to brief the Security Council on Haiti. The humanitarian situation is appalling, but there are faint glimmers of hope. I will urge the Security Council and the international community to step up for the people of Haiti at this pivotal time. I also want to say a word about the unfolding tragedy that is Gaza. Unbelievably, civilians are facing yet another deadly escalation. Israel's initial steps to militarily take over Gaza City signals a new and dangerous phase. Expanded military operations in Gaza City will have devastating consequences. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, already exhausted and traumatized, would be forced to flee yet again plunging families into even deeper peril. This must stop. At the same time, we have seen yet more unconscionable Israeli strikes, including earlier this week at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. One attack was followed by another, killing civilians, including medical personnel and journalists, who were carrying out their essential work, all with the world watching. I know so many of the reporters here, along with us, have lost their colleagues. These attacks are part of an endless catalogue of horrors. There must be accountability. Gaza is piled with rubble, piled with bodies, and piled with examples of what may be serious violations of international law. Hostages taken by Hamas and other groups must be released, and the atrocious treatment they have been forced to endure must stop. Civilians must be protected. And let's be clear, the levels of death and destruction in Gaza are without parallel in recent times. Famine is no longer a looming possibility. It's a present-day catastrophe. People are dying from hunger. Families are being torn apart by displacement and despair. Pregnant women are facing unimaginable risks. And the systems that sustain life, food, water, healthcare, have been systematically dismantled. These are the facts on the ground. And they are the result of deliberate decisions that defy basic humanity. Israel, as the occupying power, has clear obligations. It must ensure the provision of food, water, medicine, and other essentials. It must agree to and facilitate far greater humanitarian access. It must protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. And it must end the destruction of that which is indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. The International Court of Justice has given binding provisional measures. And these include the obligation to take all steps to ensure unfettered humanitarian and medical assistance to Palestinians throughout Gaza without delay and in full cooperation with the United Nations. These measures must be implemented fully and immediately. The UN and our partners are doing all we can, often at great personal risk. Indeed, 366 UN personnel have tragically been killed. Day after day, our efforts are being blocked, delayed, and denied. This is unacceptable. In the West Bank, the situation is also profoundly alarming. Military operations, settler violence, demolitions, and discriminatory policies are driving displacement and deepening vulnerability. The relentless expansion of settlements is fracturing communities and cutting off access to vital resources. The recent approval of a plan for the construction of thousands of settlements in the EU area would effectively separate the northern and southern West Bank, an existential threat to the two-state solution. I repeat, the Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have been established and are being maintained in violation of international law. Israel must cease such actions and comply with its obligations. There is no military solution to the conflict. I appeal once again for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, unfettered humanitarian access across Gaza, and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Starvation of the civilian population must never be used as a method of warfare. Civilians must be protected. Humanitarian access must be unimpeded. No more excuses, no more obstacles, no more lies. Thank you.
Be in no doubt that this is irrefutable testimony. It is a famine. The Gaza famine. It is a famine that we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine within a few hundred meters of food in a fertile land. It is a famine that hits the most vulnerable first, each with a name, each with a story, that strips people of dignity before it strips them of life. It is a famine in 2025, a 21st century famine, watched over by drones and the most advanced military technology in history. It is a famine openly promoted by some Israeli leaders as a weapon of war. It is a famine on all of our watch. Everyone owns this. The Gaza famine is the world's famine. It is a famine that asks, but what did you do? A famine that will and must haunt us all. My ask, my plea, my demand to Prime Minister Netanyahu and anyone who can reach him: enough. Ceasefire. Open the crossings, north and south, all of them. Let us get food and other supplies in, unimpeded, and at the massive scale required.
I'd like to start by thanking Deputy Special Coordinator Alek Barov, ASG Masuya, Ms. Ashing, and Ms. Gritsevsky for your sobering and powerful briefings today, which underline one single truth. It is time for this terrible conflict to end. I'll make 3 points, President. First, the IPC's confirmation of famine in Gaza City marks the first officially recorded famine in modern history in the Middle East. It is entirely man-made and, as my Foreign Secretary has said, it is a moral outrage. Over 100 children in Gaza have died of malnutrition, while food is sitting at Gaza's borders. I have 2 clear messages for Israel. Immediately lift restrictions and allow food, medical supplies and fuel to reach those in desperate need in line with international humanitarian law. And allow the UN and international NGOs to carry out their life-saving work without obstruction. It is also vital that international humanitarian law is upheld. Israel's attack on Nasser Hospital this weekend, killing civilians, health workers, and journalists, is appalling. We note the ongoing inquiry into this attack, and it is imperative that there are urgent and transparent investigations which hold those responsible to account in a meaningful way. Second, Ms. Gritsevsky provided a truly harrowing account today of the cruelty she experienced at the hands of Hamas terrorists. The United Kingdom unequivocally condemns conflict-related sexual violence wherever it occurs, and we continue to call for justice for survivors of these abhorrent crimes. Her briefing also reminded us of the agony of the hostages still held in Gaza, including her partner, Matan Zangawa. The United Kingdom has been clear that Hamas must immediately release all the hostages taken on the 7th of October and lay down their weapons. And I recall that the Security Council has called for the unconditional and immediate release of the hostages in all 4 of our resolutions since the 7th of October. But I reiterate again today that Hamas must be held accountable for their despicable actions and can have no future in the governance of Gaza. A ceasefire remains the best way to secure the release of all the remaining hostages. The Israeli government's plan to expand military operations in Gaza will only put them in further danger. We condemn this decision and urge Israel to change course. Third, Israel's decision to approve plans for settlement construction in the E1 area in the West Bank, if implemented, would be a flagrant breach of international law, and it will take us further away from peace. Israel must retract these plans. The two-state solution conference last month demonstrated the strength of support, the strength of international support for a brighter future for the region. The United Kingdom opposes any actions which undermine the viability of the two-state solution and the long-term goal of Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security. President, now is the moment for the parties to redouble their efforts to secure an immediate ceasefire. This is the path to end the suffering in Gaza, secure the release of the hostages, and deliver a framework for lasting peace in the region. I thank you.
Israel is deliberately and unashamedly imposing inhumane conditions on civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory. For more than 10 weeks, nothing has entered Gaza, no food, medicine, water, or tents. As my colleague from the FAO will explain, every single one of the 2.1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip face the risk of famine. 1 in 5 face starvation. Despite the fact that you have funded the food that could save them. We have rigorous mechanisms to ensure our aid gets to civilians and not to Hamas. But Israel denies us access, placing the objective of depopulating Gaza before the lives of civilians. It is bad enough that the blockade continues. How do you react when Israeli ministers boast of it? Or when attacks on humanitarian workers and violations of the UN's privileges and immunities continue? To the Israeli authorities, stop killing and injuring civilians. Lift this brutal blockade. Let humanitarians save lives. To Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups, release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Stop putting civilians at risk during military operations. It will be no consolation to know that future generations will hold us in this chamber to account. But they will. And if we have not seriously done all we could, then we should fear that judgment.
But I want to be clear. Calling today for a ceasefire in Gaza without any condition is just telling to the rest of the world that for us as Europeans, there is no double standard. And as we are attached to human lives, as we are attached to territorial integrity, we want a ceasefire. No discussion. And today, working together in order to recognize the state of Palestine and to initiate this political momentum is the only path to peace.
También le puntualizo una cosa, señor Rufián. Nosotros no comerciamos con un Estado genocida. No lo hacemos, señoría. Y creo que el otro día, desde esta tribuna, explicité precisamente de qué estábamos hablando, cuando se hablaba de algunas cosas que no se ajustan a la verdad.
Mención especial creo que exige, de nuevo, la catástrofe humanitaria en Gaza. Porque la hambruna en Gaza es una vergüenza para toda la humanidad. Y detenerla, por tanto, es un imperativo moral, es un imperativo humanitario y es un imperativo político. La solución la sabemos, la solución verdadera es que el primer ministro Netanyahu y su gobierno active cuanto antes un alto el fuego, abra definitivamente y plenamente el corredor humanitario terrestre y acabe con esta barbarie.
The times of words and declaration is behind. We had enough time. And at the same time, Palestinians in Gaza have no more time to lose. Every day, babies, women, men are being killed. This is the time for action. And if the association agreement is based on human rights, it's the most normal thing that we suspend immediately, today, that association agreement and that we move forward. That's why I will ask for the suspension of the association agreement, an embargo of selling weapons to Israel, and enlarging the list of people that are being sanctioned to everyone that wants to be a spoiler of the two-state solution.
Ich habe am letzten Freitag mit Ministerpräsident Netanyahu mein letztes längeres Telefonat gehabt. Ich habe ihm sehr klar und sehr deutlich gesagt, dass wir die Gaza-Politik der israelischen Regierung nicht teilen. Und es hat seitens der Bundesregierung dazu auch klare Stellungnahmen immer gegeben und daran hat sich auch heute nichts geändert. Das, was die israelische Regierung dort tut, ist aus sicherheitspolitischen Erwägungen heraus verständlich. Wir teilen es nicht und wir sehen vor allen Dingen die große Not der zivilen Bevölkerung dort. Und deswegen erneuere ich auch gerne noch einmal meinen Aufruf, jetzt wirklich der Zivilbevölkerung im Gazastreifen die notwendige humanitäre Hilfe zukommen zu lassen. Das ist so nicht akzeptabel, wie die israelische Armee dort vorgeht.
I thank the briefers for their briefings. The Gaza conflict has persisted for nearly 700 days. Gaza has long become a living hell, with the 2 million Gazan people deeply trapped in a massive man-made catastrophe, and over 1 million facing a food security emergency. The international community needs to exhaust every effort possible to prevent further deteriorations. China reiterates that violence cannot bring security, neither can force win peace. Israel's continued escalated military offensives have resulted in the loss of numerous innocent lives daily. Israel's strike on the Al-Nasser hospital on 25th of August killed over 20 civilians, journalists and medical workers, creating yet another horrendous tragedy. Israel is still moving forward with its military plan to take over Gaza. The plan, once implemented, will inevitably lead to more bloodshed and displacement, adding to the danger and insecurity both Gazans and detained hostages are facing. China objects to and condemns all actions that harm civilians, damage infrastructure, and violate international law. We urge Israel to heed the strong calls from the international community, immediately cease its military operations in Gaza, and immediately halt any dangerous moves that escalate tensions. China further reiterates that violations of international humanitarian law are unacceptable, the weaponization of humanitarian supplies is unacceptable, and the militarization of an aid distribution mechanism is equally unacceptable. All along, the biggest challenge for scaling up humanitarian assistance in Gaza has not been the shortage of supplies or the inadequacies of the UN and other humanitarian agencies. Rather, it has always been the occupying power, Israel's lack of political will and its deliberately created obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its obligations as an occupying power under the international humanitarian law by opening all border crossings, fully restoring humanitarian access, and supporting the UN's delivery of aid consistent with humanitarian principles to truly alleviate the humanitarian disaster on the ground. China reaffirms that the long unfulfilled aspiration for an independent Palestinian state is the fundamental reason preventing the solution to the Palestinian question and the root cause of the recurrent volatility of the Palestinian-Israeli situation. The Palestinian people's right to statehood, right to survival, and right to return must no longer be ignored. Israel's recent approval of a settlement expansion plan in the E1 area of the West Bank will severely undermine the contiguity of the Palestinian territory to the detriment of the foundation of a Palestinian statehood. The international community must build on the positive momentum of the two-state solution, reinvigorate the political prospect of the two-state solution with the utmost urgency, firmly reject any forced displacement of the Palestinian people, and oppose any dangerous attempts to annex the West Bank and Gaza. President, when peace is absent in the Middle East, peace is elusive for the world. At present, the Middle East situation is complex and fragile, with multiple intertwined hotspot issues. Amidst all this, however, the question of Palestine remains central to the Middle East issue. China supports the Council in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire, ending the fighting in Gaza, and alleviate the humanitarian disaster. We call on all countries, particularly the country with significant influence over the parties concerned, to uphold a just and responsible position and and play a constructive part. China will continue to work with the international community towards ending the war in Gaza, advancing the implementation of the two-state solution, and ultimately achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution of the Palestinian question, so that both the Palestinian and Palestinian peoples can live in shared tranquility and happiness. I thank you, President.
We're grateful to today's briefers for their information about the situation in the Gaza Strip. Over the past few days, we, just like many of our colleagues, were stunned by the new data on the record scale of famine in Gaza. The signals and persistent calls to Israel to immediately stop the collective punishment of the Palestinians have been forthcoming from different global capitals, including Moscow, and also international headquarter structures, regional organizations, and representatives of our global organization throughout the world. Furthermore, the world is calling on West Jerusalem to recognize that there is no alternative to a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which would pave the way for establishing genuine peace and security in the Middle East. This is the sole scenario that meets the interests both of the Israelis and all of their neighbors. Today, almost 2 years after the start of the bloody war in Gaza, indeed, it's difficult to find the right words to describe the scale of the destruction and human suffering in the Gaza Strip. The most succinct and at the same time terrifying recent depiction was by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who described the situation in Gaza with one word: hell. The UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Lazzarini, characterized the situation in the Strip as bordering on genocide, and the forced population displacement is akin to ethnic cleansing. Such statements in other cases in the assessment of the UN leadership is backed up by daily reports from Gaza about the deaths of dozens of civilians. Just the day before yesterday, indiscriminate strikes by Israel on Gaza killed 70 people. 2 days ago, live on air, as a result of the attacks on the Strip, the Nasser hospital was destroyed and more than 20 people were killed, including 5 journalists. Furthermore, judging by the images in the media, a cynical double-tap strike was used when rescue workers arrived. Even Benjamin Netanyahu already admitted that Israel's direct responsibility for what occurred, calling it a tragic mishap and promising to conduct an investigation. Mr. President, we'd like also to draw your attention to the actions of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Since the foundation started its work in May this year, the situation has turned into a completely tragic and unacceptable one. According to various assessments, more than 1,800 Palestinians have died trying to get humanitarian assistance. Thousands of them were near the distribution points that were managed by this pseudo-humanitarian structure. According to reports, strikes on civilians are occurring not only regularly, but also precisely. People in their utter despair spend the night at distribution points and in response get bullets in them. This is no humanitarian mission. This is violence hidden behind good intentions. Under the guise of so-called humanitarian work, there is a policy of fear and intimidation against defenseless civilians. These methods are unacceptable. There's no doubt whatsoever that the work of the Foundation in its current form is dangerous and is not in line with recognized humanitarian principles, and denying this is pointless. Mr. President, given this, we're seriously concerned about reports in the media that the UN Secretariat, allegedly ceding to pressure from Israel and the US, has committed to ratcheting down the rhetoric regarding the GHF. We would like to note that starting from August, whatever the situation in the humanitarian reports in the UN have de facto stopped mentioning the work of this structure. We believe that these assurances, we hope that these assurances do not reflect reality. We are convinced that the UN Secretariat cannot and should not renounce its principles, namely that humanitarian assistance should not be turned into an instrument of blackmail. We trust that the Secretary General and the humanitarian wing of the UN will consistently and unambiguously advocate for humanitarian assistance to be provided in strict compliance with the norms of international humanitarian law and the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Mr. President, the horrific statistics of the number of victims caused by the Israeli military operation in Gaza, more than 63,000 Palestinians have died, is in no way stopping the Netanyahu government that has opted to cleanse the densely populated Gaza city and to take total control over the Gaza Strip. West Jerusalem is not sobered either by the opinion of the overwhelming majority of the international community. We'd like to remind you that on the 10th of August, during the emergency meeting of the Security Council, almost all delegations, including those from Arab and Muslim countries, condemned the new escalatory actions of Israel, underscoring the growing security risks not only to the inhabitants of Gaza, but also to the Israeli hostages held there. We are also surprised that the IDF operation to take Gaza City was started against a background of reports that Hamas had agreed to the proposal of the mediators to release some hostages and to a temporary ceasefire. We are closely following the diplomatic efforts of the mediators, inter alia the efforts of Washington. Quite frankly, we do see some discrepancies in the views on how the negotiations are going. American colleagues are always saying that Hamas is refusing to do a deal. The US delegation has been trying to convince the Security Council at least of this over the past few months. At the same time, there are signs that the movement is prepared to do a deal, and Israel's either rejecting the mediators' proposal or is simply expanding the hostilities on the ground and is not demonstrating real interest in reaching agreement. This was publicly announced yesterday in the Qatari media, which, along with the US and Egypt, is participating in the negotiations. We have heard, colleagues, about the American aggressive diplomacy on the ground for some months now, but once again, we regrettably are convinced that it is not giving encouraging results. We would urge our American colleagues to think not only about the interests of Israel, that they have been banging on about with great zeal, but also the fate of Palestinian civilians whose lives and futures today, to a large extent, depend on the action or the inaction of this council. Sir, multilateral diplomacy alone, which we are strongly urging our US colleagues to engage in, can and should give a chance to revive the two-state formula. This principle, enshrined in the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly of the UN, today truly is under threat. The reason for this, and in the case of the man-made humanitarian disaster in Gaza that runs counter to international law, is Israel's policy to establish new facts on the ground. The most high-profile was the recent decision by the Higher Planning Committee to approve settlement construction in Area E1 in the West Bank to the east of Jerusalem. We all understand that the implementation of this large-scale expansionist project will breach the contiguity of the territorial integrity of a future Palestinian state, dividing up the West Bank into two isolated enclaves, separate from each other. What is frightening in this regard is not only the concept itself and the unambiguous utterances of Israeli officials. For example, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Smotrich, clearly stated that the plan would permanently bury the idea of a Palestinian state. That's the end of quote. But also that such provocative acts are enjoying support from some American senior diplomats. The US ambassador to Israel, Mr. Mike Huckabee, pointed out that the E1 area construction apparently did not violate international law. Such opinions directly run counter to the foundational document of Middle East settlement process and also the recent decisions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2334. Mr. President, in conclusion, we'd like to underscore our unwavering stance in favour of having diplomatic settlement alone to the Palestinian question based on the two-state, two-people solution to meet the legitimate concerns of Israel in the area of security and also the rightful expectations of the Palestinian people to their own state. The alternative to this is further isolation of Western Jerusalem and the international scene and the growth and the number of civilian in Gaza victims. Israel is thus not going to solve the problem of its own security, but it would just be simply pushing it off by fostering revenge and hatred among young Palestinians. This is extremely short-sighted and an irresponsible policy. Thank you very much.
Ik begrijp begrijp zeer goed dat het een gevoelig punt is, een heel gevoelig thema. We zien ook allemaal die beelden en iedereen is daardoor geraakt. Maar we moeten natuurlijk ook verder kunnen besturen met de problemen die hier nog op ons bord liggen, hier in Vlaanderen. En dat zijn er meer dan genoeg, zeker de komende maand. En dan is het belangrijk dat we dit kunnen achter ons laten, dat we nu weten hoe we willen reageren, welk signaal we willen geven en onder welke vorm.
Yes, Chairman. There are organisations that have looked into this. Those are working every day to save the lives of those children. That's Doctors Without Borders, for example. That's Save the Children, for example. They say there is no room in the region. So what information then does this minister need to make this decision? And what information does this minister have to assume that this is not true?
The World Health Organization has made a request also to us to accommodate some Palestinian children patients. In England, for example, a boy with a deformed face who needs special surgery, a girl who is almost blind, that kind of special specific case. England, Ireland, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Norway, all are taking in some of those kinds of patients. The Netherlands did not. The question I want to ask this minister is what makes the Netherlands the exception here? One of the countries that does not comply with the World Health Organization. What makes us different from these other countries?
Each country chooses whether or not to undertake certain efforts. For example, we chose to perform eye drops. Some other countries have not. We choose to look initially at if there is still room in the region. There are also good medical facilities to establish that there, and we are prepared for that. We did that before, but to provide funding for that now, right now, that is a commitment of the Cabinet. And I just said earlier that I am prepared to report on that soon, when I have also been able to delve more deeply into how that inventory is doing. But we think there are opportunities for that. Motion 6, when it comes to the Palestinian state. Yes, I think the foreign minister has really talked to you at length about this, that we support a two-state solution and that the recognition of a Palestinian state must ultimately be part of that two-state solution, and that we do not anticipate that. We intend to do it. So that's why I also advise against Motion 6. Motion 7 is about where the law that we intend when it comes to demonstrations. Yes, the Chamber also knows how we are in that. So we do not intend to suddenly repeal this law now. That would be a big change from the Cabinet's commitment. And then Motion 8 is again about a broad trade boycott. I think I just explained how we look at it. So not in a broad sense. Motion 9. I think there was an adjustment to that in terms of doing an intervention in the genocide case, which the foreign minister advised against in the earlier version. I concur. I do want to pledge that to delve further into that and come up with a more comprehensive explanation of the OP there. I had a lot of debates in my life about sanctions toward all kinds of countries, and it's always a trade-off. On the one hand, you want certain policy or action. You want to discourage and aid Israel to change course in this regard when it comes to settlement policy, and you always know what adverse effects it has for people and for citizens who live there. Sometimes the penny weighs. The penny falls one way, and other times it falls the other way. The fact that when it comes to a settlement policy, despite all the deterrent policies that are already in place, despite the diplomatic pressure that is already in place, despite the many condemnations, Israel continues to do so. Therefore, we also feel that we want to further increase the pressure to change course. We try to do that as effectively as possible, European first, and otherwise consider doing it with a group of like-minded countries. In the meantime, we are not sitting still. We are talking about the illegal settlements and now Ms. Dobby is bringing Gaza and hunger through that again. We are now talking about settlement policy. I'm not talking about a very long roadmap. I'm talking about next week's draft. That is where our commitment is European. And if not, then we will consider national measures because we want to increase the pressure on Israel.
We have a lot of foreign ministers standing there recently. Well, 4 I think, who said every time yes. But now we're really going to install an investigation. But now we're going to do something of possibly sanctions. When is it enough? When will it be enough for this administration?
Ms. Pyrie can raise her voice. That does not mean she will get a different answer. The fact that we are willing to go further than we have in the past, the fact that we are willing to increase the pressure on Israel and on the settlement policy, that shows that we as a cabinet very clearly disapprove of that. Ms. Pyrie, who can then raise her voice, she can also shout all kinds of things outside the microphone. Then I join Mr. Van der Berg's appeal. Let's do this debate a little bit normally.
Motion 6 of our end recognizes a Palestinian state being adopted. That is a very simple question. So is the cabinet going to do that or not?
Well, I don't expect that one to be adopted. And if it did, I'm going to discuss that first in the cabinet and how we deal with that. Look, if you look at the group of countries that have some kind of contact with Hamas, it's quite broad in the sense there's Iran in between. But it also includes Egypt, which is in a lot of ways constructive cooperation partner. So if I may read him this way, we are trying to increase pressure on Hamas through those countries that have contacts with Hamas.
Excellencies, South Africa is concerned about the military action by the State of Israel against the people of Gaza, which we have characterized as genocide, is deeply concerning. This genocide led South Africa to approach the International Court of Justice with a view to stopping the killing of innocent women and children in Gaza. We do believe that the world cannot just sit by and watch the slaughter of innocent people continuing. South Africa has been unwavering in its support towards all efforts aimed at the establishment of a viable Palestinian state, existing side by side in peace with Israel, within internationally recognized borders based on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. And this would be in line with all UN resolutions, international law, and internationally agreed parameters. We do call on the international community and the United Nations Security Council to address this spiraling conflict. On our own continent, Africa, Sudan enters its second year of horrific conflict and devastation. This is another conflict that the world seems to have forgotten about. The protracted conflicts in the Sahel and Great Lakes regions in Africa persist. We must find lasting solutions to all these conflicts. We must remain committed to the peaceful resolution of all disputes through negotiation and inclusive dialogue. And we must safeguard the ability of states to pursue independent foreign policy. And we must safeguard the multilateral system, because it is the cornerstone of international relations that fosters an environment of peace and development. Existing global institutional mechanisms need to be both strengthened and reformed to play a constructive role in the international peace and security. We cannot allow conflicts just to continue in perpetuity. We do need to find paths to peace. In our quest for a long, interconnected, just and prosperous world, we have the ability to foster an environment of peace through a focus on sustainable development. We must also continue to support nations and peoples who seek to end the cycle of conflict and choose the path of peace. I thank you.